It's time now for the big question, in which we tackle a major news story of the day from multiple points of view. Tonight, are private schools bad for society? Britain should be very proud of its private schools and not tilt the system to ensure more pupils from state schools are admitted to Oxbridge. This according to the Education Secretary, Nadeem Zahawi, who said that admissions should be based on merit alone, as he urged people to put aside their tribalism over high-performing private schools. Meanwhile, writing for The Critic magazine, journalist and friend of the show Charlie Peters says private schools are a waste of money. Both left and right, he says, overstate their effect on educational ability and achievements in later life. Meanwhile, the press report today that state school buildings are falling apart, with 1 in 3 needing urgent repairs, not a problem facing the private sector. So, are private schools bad for society? To debate this, I'm delighted to say that the author of that article, Charlie Peters, joins me now, as well as my panellists Neil and Christine Hamilton and Professor James Tooley, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham and the founder of an international chain of low-cost, high-quality, independent schools. Great to have all of you with us. Charlie Peters, are private schools bad for society?
No, I don't think they're bad for society. I just think that their effects are wildly overstated. And I think that the cost that parents pay for these schools is insane. It's crazy. The latest stats show that to send 2 children to a private day school and then boarding from 13 will cost you over £900,000. That's an extraordinarily large amount of money just to send 2 children to school. And what's the effect of that? Well, their defenders say that they improve academic performance, they boost your networking ability, and they make you more confident. I think all 3 of these cases are vastly overstated. On academic performance, I think prior ability makes up for a lot of why people do so well at private schools. I mean, they're selective schools. You have to be smart to get into them in the first place. And then, confidence, this big line about confidence. Sure, you meet very impressive politicians and journalists and academics who are very confident. But for every person like that, there's also, a businessman who went to state school and has the kind of, the Essex wide boy character like Alan Sugar. Did he need to go to private school to gain his confidence? I don't think so. So all in all, when you line up the arguments, I think that £900,000 is more valuable than a private school education.
Neil Hamilton, you are a grammar school boy. Is there, in your view, much of a difference between grammar schools and private schools? Because Charlie Peters would argue they're both academically successful because they're selective.
Well, I think that's right. Certainly the school that I went to many, many years ago, of course, more than half a century ago, we lived in a completely different kind of country from what we see today. But I certainly never lacked in confidence by not being at a public school, quite the opposite. I've always been combative and competitive, and I've never allowed my background to hold me back in any way. I certainly have a lot of sympathy with the view that 900,000 quid to educate 2 children is an absurd amount of money after you've paid taxes for the state system as well. My view is that all schools should be independent schools in a sense, and Professor Tooley's schools I know perform that function and are extremely successful themselves. In the 1979 general election, I stood on a manifesto which included giving education vouchers to all parents so that if they wanted to educate their children in the private sector, they could get the equivalent of the average cost of a state school education to start them off. Because we don't want a monolithic education system in this country. We want competition because competition is what improves quality in every other walk of life. So why not in education? The question of whether private schools are bad for society or not is not one that interests me at all. I don't believe in social engineering, and I don't think that governments should use their power in order to try to create some kind of utopian society. Parents have a right to educate their children as they think fit. And even if they want to homeschool or they want to send them to any kind of school, whether in this country or abroad, they should have that right. But the reality is that for the overwhelming majority of people of this country, they simply can't afford to educate their children outside of the state system. And I think this is something which needs to be looked at, because I don't think that's a good thing. You know, we pay our taxes, but what's the quality of what we get for what we pay? That's the key issue here. And a lot of state schools over the years have produced an abysmal education. And as we know, the real minority which needs to be considered in this country is white working class boys, because they're right at the bottom of the educational attainment league. And so if there's going to be any kind of diversity-based support for a minority, it should be for those, because they've been failed by our education system in certain parts of our country.
Professor James Tooley, you are the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Buckingham and the founder of an international chain of low-cost private schools, including the Independent Grammar School in Durham. Tell me about that school.
Yes, I mean, I think Charlie Peters has written a very interesting article in the Critic, well worth reading, very thoughtful. But really, would you give
it an A+ or an A-?
Oh, I think it's definitely A standards. Yes, I would A+ for the. Yeah, all right, A+. There you go. No, it's a great article, but the biggest problem he has with private schools is the cost. And that's the biggest problem we all have with private schools. Well, actually, also the fact that some of them are becoming, to use that word, more woke than they need to be, and more woke than is necessary for anyone. So I think there are two sets of criticisms there. Let's remember, of course, private schools are very good for society. 7% of children go to private school, and yet 2/3 of British Nobel Prize winners were privately educated, 2/3 of British Oscar winners were privately educated, and so on. So they're very good for society, but they're too expensive. So what I've said all along, learning from the experience of other countries, why not try and have an affordable private education? And I experimented with this. It was an experiment, to be fair, a couple of years back, up in Durham, created the Independent Grammar School Durham, which is now has proven the point that we can run a private school for £3,300 a year. A year, that is not a term, a year. That's roughly half the per capita funding in the state schools. It's now passed to its Ofsted inspections. It's doing really well, very attractive, glowing testimonials from parents. So you can do it more cheaply. And Charlie, that's what we should be talking about, I think. Mark, we should be talking about creating a viable alternative, not giving up on private education. Please don't lose that independence from the state. You don't want the state to be dictating what education should be. Let's not lose that independence, but recognize these balmy prices that are just frightening everyone off, apart from that global elite. They're ridiculous. We don't need that. Let's focus on affordable private education. It's achievable.
Briefly, James Tooley, you've mentioned one advantage of the private sector is that they are less institutionally woke, with so-called progressive educational ideas. I guess private schools tend to be a bit more old-fashioned in their teaching. But why else are private schools more academically successful?
Well, I mean, what Charlie was hinting at, I think, is that it's because they just select the better. We heard the word selection a couple of times there. No, it's not to do with that. There's a study, you referred to it tangentially in your work, Charlie, but there's a study from the UCL Institute of Education which categorically shows, controlling for background variables, you do get a private school effect. Internationally, that's true, and I bet if there were better studies done in this country, you get those true as well. So it's more of a focus on basics. It's a focus on academic achievement. It's not being shy. It's not being afraid of focusing on knowledge, the imparting of knowledge, the initiation into the best that's been thought and said. These are things that are found still in the private schools. Now, there are examples who are moving away from that, but these are what we cherish in private education. And when private schools do get caught up in wokeism, I bet they can row back from wokeism much more quickly than where it's in the state sector, because parents can protest about it, parents can withdraw their children, parents can go for what they want, but it doesn't have to be so expensive. That's the key thing.
Christine Hamilton, if we eliminated all private schools, the state sector would improve overnight.
Yes, but don't forget, and this is what I'm not suggesting you're making this mistake, but a lot of people say all this money that goes into private schools, if it was directed to the state sector, well, it wouldn't be, because the people who pay for their kids to go to private schools are already paying their money into the state sector. So that wouldn't happen. Yet when what we need to do, the state sector needs to come up to the level of the private schools. But this isn't as big a problem, I don't think, as some people seem to think. I mean, I can't remember. I'm sorry. One of the speakers sitting below me here said it was 7%. I thought it was 6% of people who went to the private school, but it's 7%. And apparently 40% of those are foreigners, and vast numbers of people in this country, middle classes who were sending their children to private schools, they are now the jams, the just about managing, and they can't do it. They have saved as much as they can. They've stopped having all the other luxuries in life to try and keep their kids at school, and some of them are finding it completely impossible. But what we need to do, and the other thing, by the way, everybody says, oh, the private schools shouldn't be there because the establishment is people, you know, whether you're judges or in the cabinet or senior civil servants, it's all private schools, private schools. Not everybody wants to be a part of the establishment. 72%, I understand, of millionaires in this country didn't go to private school. Alan Sugar was mentioned. There are plenty of Alan Sugars in this world who, you know, it doesn't damn you to outer darkness just because you don't go to private school. Quite the reverse. An awful lot of people who go to state schools decide, I am going to succeed. And by God, they do.
One example, Christine, you are the author of the great British book of battle axes. One Margaret Hilda Thatcher went to state school.
One Margaret Hilda Thatcher. I had a very varied education. I was sent to a private school to start with, but at the tender age of 12, I was expelled. So I then went to a co-ed grammar school, which I loved. I mean, it was fabulous. So I've had a very mixed education. I then went to a further education college to do A-levels. So I've had a bit of everything, and it did me the world of good, but I wouldn't have missed any of it. And also, I think it was Charlie Peters, who I read his article, by the way, with great interest earlier today. He mentioned the fact that it isn't just the private school education that gives some of these people the edge in certain areas. It's nature, not nurture. It's what they get at school. You know, it's the homes they come from that have books. It's the homes they come from where the parents talk about, you know, current affairs, etc., who teach the children the whole time. So it isn't just the schools who can take the credit, if credit is due, for that.
Charlie Peters, what do you think is the way forward for our education sector?
Well, I am a ginormous supporter of Professor Tooley's plans, and I long have been. In fact, one of the first pieces I ever wrote as a journalist was in defence of low-cost private schools, with particular focus with the international space. We now have a situation where educational heroes, if they become UN leaders, they have to sign up to a pledge, which would require them to disregard low-cost private schools of any variety, which I think is a great shame. So I want more competition, more variety in education. And also I want to return to a schooling situation where focus and children who want to get ahead are allowed to do so. I think the main benefit that private schools have isn't the kind of the focus on the love of knowledge that Professor Tooley mentioned, but more that your fellow pupils are not there to detract your advancement. They will not disrupt the class. They will let you hard. That's really what parents are paying for. But I don't think they should be paying £900,000 for it.
Charlie Peters, in your fascinating piece in The Critic magazine, you actually report that quite a few kids that go to private school, including expensive boarding school, when offered the choice between getting that private education or just receiving the equivalent cash lump sum, they would take the money.
Yeah, well, I spoke to a few of my boarding school peers who said that, well, looking back on what they had at school and how much it cost, they probably take the money. In part because I think our generation, I'm 26 now, we are uniquely saddled by a housing crisis and great demands on our income. And I think when we reflect on that amount of cash, we think, goodness me, wouldn't that be rather nice? And also I think there is an awareness among all of us that actually the education that we enjoyed, while it was beautiful, while it was very helpful and we had a great friendships and all the rest of it, the main benefit was the lack of disruption. Everyone there wanted to work hard. Everyone there had been selected and passed tests that proved they could get good grades. That's the real benefit of private school. That's what I want for every child in Britain.
Speaking of what's best for every child in Britain, Neil, many viewers will be watching this who have got kids, and they might take the view that it's unfair that their kids get an inferior education simply because of their bank balance. It's not fair.
Well, they get an inferior education not because of their bank balance, but because the state fails to provide one for them, and they've got no other choice. So what we really need to do is ensure that the state education system is brought up to the standard of the best, as far as that can be done. There would be no demand for private schools if the alternative was just as good for free, as it were, bearing in mind everybody pays taxes to pay for what's supposedly free. So I think the problem here is not the private education system, but the quality of state schools. Obviously, there's huge variations in quality in state schools. Some are absolutely marvellous and up to the quality of any of the top-notch private schools. But there are so many that are dismally failing, and particularly in areas where the catchment area is with a population that doesn't have the advantages that come with being in the middle classes, if you like, with income and attitudes to learning, books in the house, and so on and so forth. So I think what we need to do is look at the real cause of educational failure, which is certainly not the schools which succeed most spectacularly.
Of course, Christine Hamilton, briefly, all of the high-profile socialists like Diane Abbott normally wind up sending their kids to private school. If you had children, would you send them to private school or put them through the state sector?
Well, if we had children, they would by now be probably 45 or 50. So, yes, I definitely would if I could possibly afford it. But people make huge sacrifices. One thing I do want to add is that I think the figure is right, but one of the experts will correct me if I'm wrong, that about 34% of pupils at private schools receive some or all help with bursaries. So they're not all having to pay these astronomical fees. And if I can mention one private school, a product who's in the news a lot is Rishi Sunak. He recently donated £100,000 to his school, Winchester, to help people who couldn't afford the fees. So it isn't everybody there who's paying the top-notch fees.
OK, well, briefly, final thoughts on this, Professor James Tooley.
Yes, it's not. The disruption is definitely a problem, and I totally agree with that. But it's not the selection that leads to a lack of disruption in the private schools. It is the fact that parents are committed and they want their children to do well. There's the accountability through parents. So forget the selection; it's the accountability that's so important. But I'm sure that £250,000, if you were going to give up your life now, as in the trajectory you're in, you would not want that. You would not want £250,000 instead of that trajectory, I'm sure.